Chef kicks Gordon Ramsay out of restaurant kitchen, says, "You're just a television star." His response left everyone speechless. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of the Golden Spoon, one of Chicago's most talked-about restaurants. Inside, the kitchen staff was deep in their pre-dinner service preparations. The rhythmic sound of knives against cutting boards mixed with the sizzle of pans being tested for temperature. "Maria, those onions need to be finer," shouted Marco Rossi, the head chef, his thick Italian accent echoing off the stainless steel surfaces. "This is a fine dining restaurant, not a diner." Maria, a young line cook, quickly adjusted her cutting technique. "Yes, chef. Sorry, chef." At 45, Marco was what many would call a chef's chef, traditional, demanding, and fiercely protective of his kitchen's integrity. His salt and pepper hair and deep smile lines told stories of decades spent over hot stoves and endless services. "Tom, check the fish stock. It should be reducing by now," Marco called out, tasting a sauce with intense concentration. "And someone tell James we need those bread baskets filled before." "Chef," Sophie, the maitre d', poked her head through the kitchen doors. "The suppliers for tomorrow's delivery are here. They need your signature." Marco wiped his hands on his apron. "Keep an eye on everything," he instructed his sous chef David. "I don't want any mistakes tonight." The food critic from the Tribune could show up any day now. The kitchen continued its practice dance as Marco stepped into his small office. The Golden Spoon had been his life for the past 15 years. He'd built it from a modest neighborhood restaurant into one of Chicago's most respected establishments. But lately, things had been different. The bills were piling up, and reservations weren't what they used to be. "These prices are higher than last month," Marco muttered, reviewing the delivery forms. "How am I supposed to—" A commotion from the kitchen interrupted his thoughts. "Oh my God, is that? It can't be. It's him." Marco emerged from his office to find his kitchen staff clustered near the entrance, phones already appearing in hands. In the doorway stood a figure he'd seen countless times on television, but never expected to see in his kitchen, Gordon Ramsay. The celebrity chef was dressed casually in jeans and a black sweater, no cameras in sight. He smiled warmly at the starstruck staff. "Good afternoon, everyone," Ramsay said politely. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Chef Ramsay." David stepped forward, extending his hand. "It's an honor to—" "What is this?" Marco's voice cut through the excitement like a knife. Something in his tone made everyone turn. His face had darkened, fists clenched at his sides. Ramsay maintained his professional demeanor. "Ah, you must be Chef Rossi. I've heard wonderful things about your restaurant. I was hoping to—" "Wonderful things?" Marco's laugh was harsh. "From who? Your television producers. Looking for another struggling restaurant to turn into one of your circus shows." The kitchen fell silent. Several staff members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Sophie, still by the office, slowly backed away. "Actually," Ramsay replied calmly, "I'm here as a guest. No cameras, no show. Just dinner." "Just dinner?" Marco stepped closer, his voice rising. "You think I don't know what you do? You swoop in with your cameras and your dramatic music, make everyone look like idiots for ratings?" Maria dropped her knife with a clatter, making everyone jump. Tom quickly turned down the fish stock that was starting to boil over. "Chef," David tried to intervene. "Maybe we should." "No." Marco's face was red now. "You're not a real chef anymore, Ramsay. You're a television personality. A celebrity who probably hasn't worked a real service in years." More phones appeared, recording the confrontation. Through the kitchen windows, curious diners were starting to gather, drawn by the commotion. "While you were becoming famous for yelling at people," Marco continued, jabbing his finger toward Ramsay's chest, "I was here every day, every single day, building this place, building a real restaurant." Ramsay remained surprisingly calm, though something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but something deeper. He opened his mouth to speak, but Marco wasn't finished. "You want to know what real cooking is?" Marco gestured wildly around his kitchen. "This, not your reality show drama. Not your catchphrases and fake rescues. This is a real kitchen with real chefs who work for their reputation." "Chef Rossi," Ramsay tried again, his voice level. "I understand you're—" "Get out!" Marco's shout echoed off the walls. "Get out of my kitchen! Go back to your television studio where you belong. You're not welcome here. You're not one of us anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the bubbling pots seemed to quiet down. Every phone was up now, capturing what would undoubtedly become viral footage within hours. Ramsay stood there for a moment, his face a mask of composure. But those closest to him could see something else. A flicker of genuine hurt in his eyes. For a brief moment, the celebrity facade cracked, revealing the chef who had started just like everyone else in that kitchen. Without a word, he turned toward the door. But at the threshold, he paused. The kitchen held its breath. "You know," Ramsay said quietly, not turning around, "I started washing dishes at 15. Worked every station. Earned my stars the hard way." He glanced back at Marco. "Just like you. Just like everyone here." Marco's face twitched, but he held his ground. "Being on television doesn't make me less of a chef," Ramsay continued. "It makes me someone who wants to share our world with others, make it better. But you're right about one thing. This is your kitchen." With that, he walked out, leaving behind a kitchen full of stunned faces and a very different atmosphere than the one he'd walked into. The silence stretched for several long seconds before Marco snapped, "What are you all staring at? We have service in an hour? Back to work." The staff scrambled back to their stations, but the energy had changed. Whispers replaced the usual kitchen banter. Glances were exchanged. Phones were tucked away, their footage already being uploaded to social media. David approached Marco cautiously. "Chef? Maybe that wasn't—" "Not now," Marco cut him off, turning to the stove, but his hands were shaking slightly as he adjusted the burner. Outside, the sun was setting over Chicago, casting golden light through the windows. In less than an hour, the dining room would fill with guests expecting the excellent food the Golden Spoon was known for. But in that moment, standing in his kitchen that suddenly felt different somehow, Marco Rossi had no idea that this evening would change everything. As he aggressively chopped herbs, trying to focus on the tasks ahead, he couldn't shake the image of Ramsay's face when he'd turned to leave. Not angry, not defensive, but understanding. Almost sad. It made Marco's stomach twist, in a way he didn't want to acknowledge. "Chef?" Maria's voice was tentative. "The onions are done. Would you like to check them?" Marco nodded curtly, but his mind was elsewhere. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Gordon Ramsay's visit to the Golden Spoon hadn't been random at all. But that truth, and its implications, would have to wait for another day. For now, there was service to prepare for, even if the kitchen's usual symphony felt oddly out of tune. As service approached, the tension in the kitchen remained palpable. The usual pre-dinner banter was replaced by hushed whispers and furtive glances at Marco, who was aggressively tasting sauces and barking orders. "These scallops are overcooked," he snapped at Tom, throwing the pan into the sink with a crash that made everyone jump. "Do it again." "Yes, chef," Tom muttered, reaching for fresh scallops. Under his breath, he whispered to Maria, "I've never seen them overcooked. He's losing it." Sophie appeared at the kitchen door again, her face concerned. "Chef, there's something you should see." "Not now," Marco growled. But Sophie persisted. "It's important. Your phone. It's been ringing non-stop. The video is already online." Marco's head snapped up. "What video?" David, the sous chef, pulled out his phone. "It's everywhere, chef. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Everyone's sharing it." Marco snatched the phone, his face growing pale as he watched himself shouting at Gordon Ramsay. The comments were brutal. "Who does this guy think he is? Talk about unprofessional." Ramsay handled it like a boss. "Rip Golden Spoon. No one's going to eat there now." His hands began to shake. "Get back to work," he shouted, but his voice cracked slightly. "We have service in 30 minutes. The kitchen staff exchanged knowing looks. They'd all seen the changes in recent months. The declining reservations, the increasing stress, the mounting bills on Marco's desk. This viral moment couldn't have come at a worse time. "Chef," David approached carefully. "Maybe we should address this. Make a statement or something." "Address what?" Marco snapped, but the fire was gone from his voice. "That I told the truth, that I stood up to." "Marco." It was Carmen, the pastry chef who'd been with him since day one. She never called him by his first name in the kitchen. "You're scared, we all see it. But taking it out on Gordon Ramsay? That wasn't standing up for anything. That was lashing out." The kitchen fell silent. Even the hood vents seemed to quiet down. Marco gripped the counter, his knuckles white. For a moment, he looked like he might explode again. But then his shoulders sagged. 15 years, he said quietly. 15 years I've put everything into this place. My savings, my marriage, my life. He looked around at his team. And now what? One viral video, and it's all over? Before anyone could respond, Sophie burst back in. Chef, the reservations, they're canceling. 3 parties just called to cancel for tonight. Marco closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. When he opened them, there was something his staff had never seen before. Fear. Okay, he said, his voice barely steady. Okay, we still have tables booked. We still have a service to run. We do our jobs. That's all we can do right now. The staff nodded, returning to their stations with renewed focus. But the atmosphere had shifted from tension to something closer to sadness. They all knew what this could mean for the restaurant's future. As the first tickets started coming in, Marco tried to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of service. But every time he called out an order, every time he tasted a sauce, he couldn't shake the image of Ramsay's face. Not the television personality, but the chef who'd started just like him. The chef who'd said, "Just like you, just like everyone here." The evening progressed, each canceled reservation feeling like another nail in the coffin. The dining room was half empty, something unheard of for a Friday night at the Golden Spoon. Around 9 o'clock, a food critic from a local blog walked out without ordering, having recognized the restaurant from the viral video. Marco watched through the kitchen window, his heart sinking. Chef. Sophie appeared again, this time with tears in her eyes. The Tribune called. They're canceling next week's review. And that was when Marco Rossi, the proud chef who'd built the Golden Spoon from nothing, the man who'd just hours ago stood up to Gordon Ramsay, did something his staff had never seen him do. He sat down on a prep counter, put his face in his hands, and began to cry. The kitchen stopped. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft bubbling of stocks and the distant murmur of the few remaining diners. "I've ruined everything," he whispered. "Everything I built. Everything we built together." David stepped forward, placing a hand on his mentor's shoulder. "Chef, it's not over. We'll figure something out. We always do." But Marco just shook his head. What none of them knew was that the Golden Spoon had been struggling long before this incident. The pandemic had hit them hard and recovery had been slow. Bills were piling up, and Marco had been using his personal savings to make payroll. And now, this. As the reality of what had happened, what he had done, sank in, Marco Rossi realized that his outburst hadn't just been about Gordon Ramsay. It had been about fear. Fear of failure. Fear of losing everything. Fear of becoming irrelevant in a changing industry. The same fears, he now realized, that probably drove Gordon Ramsay to television in the first place. To try to make a difference in an industry that could be brutally unforgiving. The irony wasn't lost on him. As service wound down, much earlier than usual due to the cancellations, Marco gathered his team. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "Not just for tonight, for the past few months, for everything. You all deserve better." One by one, his staff hugged him, something that would have been unthinkable just hours ago. They were more than employees, they were family. And family sticks together even when things get tough. What Marco didn't know, couldn't know, was that while he was having his breakdown in the kitchen, several of those viral videos had made their way to a very particular set of eyes. Eyes that would see something different in the footage. Something beyond an angry chef lashing out. But that revelation would have to wait for another day. For now, Marco Rossi, the proud chef of the Golden Spoon, had to face the hardest service of his life. The long night ahead, wondering if he just destroyed everything he'd spent his life building. As he locked up the restaurant that night, the Chicago streets oddly quiet, he couldn't help but wonder, what would tomorrow bring? And more importantly, would the Golden Spoon still be standing to see it? The morning after the incident dawned gray and cold over Chicago. Marco arrived at the Golden Spoon earlier than usual, his eyes red from a sleepless night. As he unlocked the front door, his phone buzzed again, another notification about the viral video. "Just delete the app," he muttered to himself, hands shaking slightly as he punched in the alarm code. The restaurant felt different in the morning light, emptier somehow, despite nothing having changed. The quiet was interrupted by a knock at the back door. It was Carmen, the pastry chef, arriving early, as always. "You look terrible," she said bluntly, hanging up her coat. Marco attempted a smile. "Thanks, that's exactly what I needed to hear." "Have you seen the numbers?" she asked, pulling out her phone. "Don't, please." Marco raised his hand. "I can't. I just need to focus on today." But Carmen wasn't letting him off that easy. 7 million views, Marco. 7 million. The Food Network shared it. BuzzFeed has an article. Even Anthony Bourdain's old Twitter account reposted it with a comment. Marco's face paled. What? What did he say? Sometimes the loudest voices hide the deepest fears. People are analyzing every second of that video, Marco. They're not just seeing an angry chef anymore. They're seeing a desperate one, Marco finished, slumping onto a prep table. The back door opened again as David arrived, followed closely by Maria and Tom. The usual morning banter was absent, replaced by cautious glances and whispered greetings. "Chef." David approached carefully. "We need to talk about today's service." "The reservations." Marco nodded wearily. "How bad?" 70% cancellations, and the phone keeps ringing, with more cancellations, not bookings. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the usual morning sounds, the hum of refrigerators, the clicking of gas pilots, seemed muted. "Right," Marco straightened up, trying to summon his usual authority. "Then we prep for what we have. We show the people who do come why this restaurant earned its reputation. He was interrupted by Sophie bursting through the door, her face flushed. "Chef, you need to see this. Now." She thrust her tablet forward, showing a morning talk show. On screen, Gordon Ramsay sat in a comfortable chair, the host leaning forward eagerly. "Turn it up," Carmen whispered, as everyone gathered around. "So, Gordon," the host was saying, "everyone's seen the video from the Golden Spoon. What do you have to say about Chef Rossi's outburst?" Marco's heart stopped. This was it. Ramsay's revenge. He'd trash the restaurant on national television, and whatever chance they had of survival would vanish. But Ramsay's response surprised everyone. "You know," he began thoughtfully, "this industry, it's not just about cooking, it's about pressure, constant, relentless pressure. Every service, every dish, every day. Sometimes it gets to be too much." The host leaned in. "Are you defending his behavior?" "No." Ramsay shook his head. "But I understand it. 20 years ago, that could have been me. That anger, that fear of losing everything you've built. I've been there." Marco's hands began to shake. "What struck me most," Ramsay continued, "wasn't his anger. It was what he said about being there every day, building something real. That's the heart of our industry. Every chef who's ever opened their own place knows that feeling. The sacrifice, the dedication." The host tried to interject with another question, but Ramsay wasn't finished. "You know what I did after I left? I went around the corner and had a coffee. And I thought about my early days when the pressure nearly broke me. When I was so focused on proving myself that I forgot why I fell in love with cooking in the first place." The camera zoomed in on Ramsay's face, showing genuine emotion. "Chef Rossi isn't a villain. He's a chef who's hurting. And sometimes when we're hurting, we lash out at the very people who might understand us best." Sophie paused the video. Nobody spoke for several long moments. He defended me?" Marco's voice was barely a whisper. "No," Carmen corrected. "He understood you. There's a difference." The kitchen remained silent as the weight of Ramsay's words sank in. Marco stared at the frozen image on the tablet, his face a mixture of confusion and shame. "There's more," Sophie said softly, pressing play again. "So what happens now?" the host was asking. "Will you be taking any action against the Golden Spoon?" Ramsay's response was immediate. "Why would I? Look, this industry is hard enough without us tearing each other down. What Chef Rossi needs isn't condemnation. He's getting plenty of that on social media. What he needs is remembering why he started cooking in the first place." Marco turned away, unable to watch anymore. His hands gripped the edge of the stainless steel counter, knuckles white. "Chef," Maria's voice was tentative. "Are you okay?" A harsh laugh escaped him. "Okay? The man I publicly humiliated is defending me on national television. How am I supposed to be okay with that?" Maybe, David suggested carefully, we should reach out to him? Apologize? And say what? Marco spun around, his voice rising. Sorry I acted like a complete ass? Sorry I let my fear and pride destroy everything? Carmen stepped forward, her voice firm. Yes, exactly that. Because that's the truth, isn't it? The morning prep continued in subdued tones. The usual kitchen banter was replaced by the mechanical sounds of knives on cutting boards and pots being filled. Every few minutes, someone's phone would buzz with another notification about the viral video. Around noon, Sophie appeared again, her face grave. Chef, there's a food critic here. Marco's head snapped up. What? Who? James Chen. From Food and Wine. The kitchen fell silent. James Chen was notorious for showing up at restaurants in crisis, writing either redemption stories or brutal takedowns. There was rarely any middle ground. He's requesting the tasting menu, Sophie continued. All 9 courses. Marco closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. When he opened them, there was a determination that had been missing all morning. Right, he said, his voice steady for the first time that day. We do what we've always done. We cook. David, start the duck confit. Maria, I want those scallops perfect. Tom, check the lamb temperature. The kitchen sprang to life, but something was different. The fear and tension from earlier had been replaced by a focused intensity. This wasn't just another service. This was a fight for survival. As Marco began plating the first course, a delicate composition of butter-poached lobster with vanilla parsnip puree, his hands shook slightly. Everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for, could hinge on these 9 plates. Chef. Carmen appeared at his side, gently steadying his hand as he placed a microherb. Remember why you started cooking? Marco paused, the tweezers hovering over the plate. He thought back to his grandmother's kitchen in Naples, the smell of tomato sauce simmering on Sunday mornings. He remembered his first job as a dishwasher, staying late to watch the line cooks work, dreaming of having his own kitchen someday. First course, Sophie announced, appearing at the pass. He's ready. Marco gave the plate one final inspection. It was perfect, not because of technique or presentation, but because it carried a piece of his soul, just like every dish he'd ever created. The next 2 hours were a blur of intense concentration. Each course that left the kitchen was a statement, not of pride or defiance, but of passion and dedication. Marco touched every plate, making minute adjustments, ensuring every element was exactly as it should be. Between courses, Chen's face revealed nothing. He ate methodically, taking notes on his phone, occasionally closing his eyes as if to better concentrate on the flavors. As the final dessert, Carmen's signature chocolate soufflé with salted caramel ice cream, left the kitchen, Marco felt drained. He slumped against the counter, emotionally exhausted. Now we wait, David said quietly. But they didn't have to wait long. 10 minutes later, Sophie rushed into the kitchen, her eyes wide. He wants to speak with you, chef, in the dining room. Marco straightened his chef's coat, wiped his hands, and took a deep breath. As he walked through the kitchen doors, his staff watched in tense silence. James Chen sat at his table, the empty soufflé dish pushed slightly to the side. He gestured to the chair opposite him. Sit down, Chef Rossi. Marco complied, his heart pounding. You know why I'm here, Chen began, his voice neutral. To write about the chef who lost his mind and yelled at Gordon Ramsay? Marco's attempt at humor fell flat. No, Chen replied, leaning forward. I'm here because in 15 years of reviewing restaurants, I've learned that the most interesting stories happen when a chef is at their breaking point. When everything they've built is threatened. That's when you see their true character. He pulled out his phone, showing Marco the viral video. I've watched this 20 times. You know what I see? Not anger. Pain. The kind of pain that comes from watching something you love slip away. Marco's throat tightened. The restaurant. We've been struggling. Even before this. Chen nodded. The pandemic, rising costs, changing dining habits. You're not alone, chef. But what makes your story different is what happened this morning. He played Ramsay's interview. Marco watched it again, each word hitting harder than before. He saw it too, Chen continued. The pain behind the anger, and instead of retaliating, he showed understanding. That's rare in this industry. Marco stared at his hands, unable to speak. Your food tonight, Chen said, his tone softening, was exceptional. Every dish told a story. Not of a chef trying to prove something, but of someone who genuinely loves cooking. Someone who's lost their way a bit, perhaps, but hasn't lost their soul. He stood up, gathering his things. My article comes out tomorrow, but I'll tell you this, it's not going to be about the viral video. It's going to be about redemption. About remembering why we do what we do. As Chen walked away, he paused at the door. Oh, and Chef Rossi? The soufflé? Best I've had in Chicago. Marco sat alone in the dining room for a long time, Chen's words echoing in his mind. When he finally returned to the kitchen, his staff was waiting expectantly. Well, Carmen demanded, what did he say? Marco looked around at their faces. His family, really, more than just staff. People who had stuck by him despite everything. He said. Marco's voice cracked slightly. He said we haven't lost our soul. The relief in the kitchen was palpable. But before anyone could celebrate, Sophie appeared once again, her face unreadable. Chef, there's someone else here to see you. And there, in the doorway of his kitchen, stood Gordon Ramsay. The kitchen froze at the sight of Gordon Ramsay standing in the doorway. Unlike yesterday, he was dressed formally in a crisp black suit. Marco felt his heart stop. Chef Rossi. Ramsay's voice was professional, neutral. May we speak privately? Marco nodded numbly, gesturing toward his small office. As they walked past the line, every eye in the kitchen followed them. David gave Marco a supportive nod. The office was barely big enough for 2 people. Stacks of invoices and past due notices cluttered the desk. Marco hastily tried to gather them, but Ramsay raised his hand. Leave them, he said softly. They're part of why I'm here. Marco's stomach dropped. I don't understand. Ramsay took a seat. His expression, unreadable. 2 months ago, my restaurant group received an interesting proposal. A struggling but highly respected Chicago restaurant was quietly looking for investors. The color drained from Marco's face. How did you? Your bank, Ramsay continued. They reached out to several restaurant groups. We weren't the only ones interested, but we were the most persistent. Marco collapsed into his chair. The bank wasn't supposed to. I was just exploring options. Marco. Ramsay leaned forward, using his first name. Your restaurant isn't just struggling. It's 3 months away from bankruptcy. The words hit like a physical blow. Marco had known things were bad, but hearing it stated so bluntly. Yesterday. Ramsay continued. I didn't come here by chance. I came to see the restaurant for myself. To understand why a chef with your reputation, your talent, would be in this situation. And then I made a complete fool of myself. Marco laughed bitterly. Actually, Ramsay's expression softened. You showed me exactly what I needed to see. He pulled out a folder from his briefcase. 2 weeks ago, my group acquired a controlling stake in your restaurant's debt. The paperwork goes public tomorrow. Marco felt the room spin. You own my restaurant? No, Ramsay corrected. We own your debt. What happens next is up to you. Marco stood up abruptly, anger flaring. So that's it? You buy my debt, and now you can force me out? Is this revenge for yesterday? Sit down, Marco. Ramsay's voice was firm but kind. If I wanted revenge, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have defended you on television this morning. Reluctantly, Marco sat back down. Look at these. Ramsay spread several papers across the desk. Your food costs are 15% above industry standard. Your energy bills are through the roof because your equipment is outdated. Your wine inventory is 3 times what it should be for a restaurant this size. I know, Marco said quietly. I've been trying to fix it, but you're too proud to ask for help, Ramsay finished. Too scared to admit that being a great chef doesn't automatically make you a great businessman. The words stung, because they were true. Marco stared at the papers, seeing his dream crumbling in columns of red numbers. Do you know why I really came yesterday? Ramsay asked. Marco shook his head. Because your staff wrote to us. Not about the money problems. They didn't know about those. They wrote about you, about your passion for teaching young cooks, about how you give second chances to people others won't hire, about how you still cook at the homeless shelter every Sunday. Marco looked up, surprised. They wrote to you? 7 different letters. Ramsay pulled them out, all saying the same thing, that the Golden Spoon isn't just a restaurant. It's a family, and their father figure is losing his way. Tears welled in Marco's eyes. He quickly wiped them away. "What you said yesterday," Ramsay continued, "about me not being a real chef anymore. It hurt. Not because it was true, but because I've heard those words before, from myself." He leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "When I started doing television, many of my old colleagues said the same thing. That I was selling out, that I'd forgotten my roots. But you know what I really was doing? Finding a way to make a difference in an industry that can be brutally hard on people's mental health, their families, their lives." Marco thought about his own failed marriage, the birthdays he'd missed, the holidays spent in the kitchen instead of with family. "So here's what's going to happen." Ramsay pulled out one final document. "My group will restructure your debt. We'll upgrade your equipment, streamline your inventory, modernize your systems. But most importantly, we'll turn the Golden Spoon into what it should have been all along, a teaching kitchen." Marco looked up sharply. "What? Your passion isn't just cooking, it's teaching, mentoring, building people up. So let's do that. Let's create a program where young chefs can learn not just cooking, but business, mental health, work-life balance, all the things we had to learn the hard way." "And what's the catch?" Marco asked suspiciously. "The catch," Ramsay smiled, "is that you have to let go of your pride. Accept help. Learn things you don't know. Can you do that?" Marco stared at the document for a long moment. Everything in him wanted to refuse, to maintain his independence. But he thought about his staff, his family, and what they'd written in those letters. "I need time to think," he said finally. "Of course," Ramsay stood up. "But Marco, you should know something. Those young chefs you've trained over the years, 4 of them have opened their own restaurants. 3 have earned Michelin stars. That's your real legacy, not the bills on your desk." He headed for the door but paused. "Oh, and one more thing. James Chen's review? I've read it. It comes out tomorrow, same time as our acquisition announcement. He calls you Chicago's hidden gem of culinary education. Funny timing, wouldn't you say?" With that, he left, leaving Marco alone with a stack of papers that represented both the end of one dream and the possible beginning of another. Outside the office, the kitchen was silent, everyone pretending they hadn't been trying to listen through the door. Marco emerged, his face unreadable. "Chef?" David stepped forward. "Is everything okay?" Marco looked at his team, really looked at them. Carmen, who'd been with him from the start, David, who he'd trained from dishwasher to sous chef, Maria, Tom, Sophie, all of them waiting, worried, caring. "You wrote to Gordon Ramsay about me?" His voice cracked slightly. They exchanged guilty looks. "We were worried," Carmen admitted. "You haven't been yourself lately. We thought maybe I needed someone who'd understand," Marco finished. He walked to the center of the kitchen, his kitchen, and took a deep breath. "I've been proud, too proud, and scared. I've been watching everything I built start to slip away, and instead of asking for help, I got angry. I took it out on everyone, including a man who was just trying to help." He picked up a knife, testing its edge. A chef's nervous habit. "Tomorrow, some big changes are going to be announced. But tonight we have service. And maybe for the first time in months, I remember why we do this." The kitchen came alive, but differently than before. There was hope in the air, anticipation. Marco looked at the office door where Ramsay had exited, then at the stack of papers on his desk. Tomorrow would bring challenges, changes, maybe even a new beginning. But for now, there was food to cook, family to feed. And somewhere in between the stress and fear and pride, Marco Rossi remembered something important. Sometimes the biggest act of courage isn't standing your ground. Sometimes it's having the strength to accept help when you need it most. The evening service began slowly, the dining room still suffering from the day's cancellations. But something was different in the kitchen. The tension that had plagued them for months had lifted, replaced by a cautious optimism. "Chef." Sophie appeared at the pass. "Table 4 is asking about the duck confit." Marco tasted the sauce, adjusting the seasoning with a precision that had been missing lately. "Tell them it'll be worth the wait." As he worked, his mind kept drifting to the papers in his office. Ramsay's offer represented everything he'd been fighting against, admitting he needed help, accepting that he couldn't do it all alone. Yet somehow, it also felt like a lifeline. "Hey," Carmen nudged him, noticing his distraction. "Where's your head at?" Marco gestured vaguely toward the office. "Did you know about the letters? The ones you all wrote?" Carmen smiled softly. "We didn't write them to hurt you, Marco. We wrote them because we believe in you, in what this place could be." "A teaching kitchen," Marco mused, plating a perfect portion of duck. "That's what Ramsay called it." "Isn't that what it already is?" David chimed in, working beside them. "How many cooks have come through here? How many careers started at that prep station?" Marco looked around his kitchen with new eyes. At Maria, who'd arrived 3 years ago barely speaking English, now confidently running the fish station. At Tom, who'd overcome addiction to become one of his most reliable line cooks. At David himself, who'd started as a teenager washing dishes and was now his right hand. "Table 7 needs their appetizers," Sophie's voice cut through his thoughts. The rhythm of service took over, but Marco's movements felt different. Each plate that left his pass carried not just food, but possibility. The possibility of what the Golden Spoon could become. Around 9, an elderly couple came into the kitchen to compliment the chef, a rare occurrence these days. The woman touched Marco's arm gently. "We've been coming here for 10 years, she said. "Tonight's meal, it reminded us of why we fell in love with your cooking in the first place." Marco felt his throat tighten. "Thank you," he managed. That means a lot." After they left, he gathered his team. "I need to tell you something," he began. "The restaurant, we're in trouble. More trouble than I've admitted, even to myself." The staff exchanged glances. They'd known, of course. The late supplier payments, the reduced hours, the mounting tension. They weren't blind. "Gordon Ramsay's restaurant group," Marco continued. "They've bought our debt. Tomorrow, it becomes public." A collective gasp went through the kitchen. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth. "But it's not what you think," Marco hurried on. "They're not shutting us down. They wanted to help. To make this place what it should have been all along. A real teaching kitchen. A place where people can learn not just cooking, but everything else this industry needs." "And you're okay with this?" David asked carefully. Marco ran a hand through his hair. "Honestly, I don't know. My pride says no. My pride says I should fight, stay independent, figure it out myself. But my pride is also what got us here." He looked at each of them in turn. "Those letters you wrote, why didn't you just come to me? Tell me you were worried." "Would you have listened?" Carmen asked gently. "Really listened?" The question hung in the air, heavy with truth. "No," Marco admitted finally. "Probably not. I was too scared of appearing weak. Too worried about losing respect. Too human?" Maria suggested with a small smile. Marco couldn't help but laugh. "Yeah, too human." The night wound down slowly. As they cleaned, the conversation flowed more freely than it had in months. Plans were discussed, ideas shared. The future, which had seemed so dark just days ago, began to take on new colors. After everyone left, Marco sat alone in his office, staring at the papers Ramsay had left. The acquisition documents, the teaching kitchen proposal, the debt restructuring plans. His phone buzzed. An email from James Chen. The review would go live at midnight. Marco's finger hovered over the link, fear and hope battling in his chest. Instead of opening it, he picked up the teaching kitchen proposal. As he read through it properly this time, he began to see not just a business plan, but a vision. A vision of what the Golden Spoon could become. Not just a restaurant, but a place of learning, growth, and second chances. He thought about Ramsay's words, "That's your real legacy, not the bills on your desk." Looking around his small office, at the awards on the walls, the framed reviews, the countless memories, Marco Rossi made a decision. He picked up his phone and dialed the number Ramsay had left. It went to voicemail. "Chef Ramsay," Marco began, his voice steady. "About your offer. I've been thinking about what you said. About pride and asking for help. About legacies and teaching." He took a deep breath. "I'm ready to talk, really talk, about the future of the Golden Spoon, about what we could build together." He hung up and leaned back in his chair. Through the office window, he could see the first light of dawn breaking over Chicago. A new day was coming, bringing with it changes he'd never expected to accept. But for the first time in months, maybe years, Marco Rossi felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. The morning sun cast long shadows through the Golden Spoon's windows as Marco arrived earlier than usual. The events of the past few days felt like a blur. The confrontation, the viral video, Ramsay's visit, and finally, his late-night voicemail accepting help. He'd barely slept, checking his phone constantly for a response. None had come. "You're here early." Carmen's voice made him jump. She stood in the doorway, apron in hand. "Couldn't sleep either?" Marco shook his head. "I kept thinking about—" The sound of cars pulling up outside interrupted him. Through the window, they watched as 3 black SUVs parked in front of the restaurant. "What the—" Marco started, but before he could finish, Gordon Ramsay stepped out of the first vehicle, followed by several people in business suits. "The board of directors," Marco whispered, his mouth going dry. "Carmen, call everyone. Tell them to come in early. They should be here for this." Within 20 minutes, the entire staff had assembled in the kitchen, watching nervously as Marco paced back and forth. Finally, Sophie appeared at the door. "Chef, they're ready for you." The dining room had been transformed. The tables had been pushed together to form one long conference setup. Gordon Ramsay sat at one end, surrounded by 6 people Marco didn't recognize, all with laptops and documents spread before them. "Chef Rossi." Ramsay stood, extending his hand. "Thank you for meeting us so early. I got your message." Marco shook his hand, noticing how different this felt from their last encounter. I wasn't expecting the whole board." "Well," a woman in her 50s spoke up, "when Gordon told us about your voicemail, we decided this couldn't wait. I'm Sarah Mitchell, CEO of Ramsay Restaurant Group." Marco sat down heavily in the offered chair. The woman, Sarah, slid a folder across the table. "We've spent the night reviewing everything," she continued. "Your restaurant's history, your training programs, the impact you've had on Chicago's culinary scene. It's impressive." "Not impressive enough to stay solvent," Marco said bitterly. "Actually," another board member chimed in, "that's where you're wrong. Your problem isn't your cooking or your training. It's your business model." Ramsay leaned forward. "Marco, do you know how many chefs who've worked under you have gone on to open successful restaurants? 4 or 5, maybe?" 17, Ramsay corrected. 17 successful restaurants in the past 15 years. 3 with Michelin stars. That's not just impressive, it's extraordinary." Marco blinked in surprise. He'd never kept count. "But while you were building others up," Sarah added, "you were letting your own foundation crumble. Noble but unsustainable. Which brings us to our proposal." Ramsay stood up and walked to a whiteboard that had been set up. Not just debt restructuring, but a complete reimagining of what the Golden Spoon can be. For the next hour, they laid out their vision. The restaurant would remain open for dinner service, but during the day, it would become a culinary education center. Not just cooking classes, but business management, mental health workshops, sustainability practices. "We want to formalize what you've been doing informally for years," Ramsay explained, drawing diagrams on the board. "Create a proper curriculum, bring in experts, make the Golden Spoon the place where the next generation of chef entrepreneurs are born." Marco listened, his mind racing. "And my staff?" "Keep them all," Sarah said immediately. "In fact, we want to expand. David's been running your informal apprentice program, hasn't he? We want to make him the official director of education." Through the kitchen doors, Marco could see his team trying to pretend they weren't listening. He smiled despite himself. "There's one more thing," Ramsay said, pulling out a final document. "This isn't just about us saving your restaurant, Marco. This is a partnership, equal stakes, equal say in how we move forward." Marco stared at the contract. "Why? After how I treated you?" "Because you reminded me of myself." Ramsay sat down next to him. 20 years ago, I was you, angry, scared, too proud to admit I needed help. Someone gave me a chance then. Now it's my turn to do the same." The room fell silent as Marco read through the contract. Pages of legal terms, financial commitments, and at the end, 2 signature lines. One for Ramsay Restaurant Group, one for him. "Can I?" He cleared his throat. "Can I speak to my staff first?" "Of course," Sarah smiled. Take all the time you need. Marco walked into his kitchen, where his team immediately pretended to be busy with prep work. He couldn't help but laugh. Okay, everyone, circle up. They gathered around, faces expectant. Marco looked at each of them. Carmen, David, Maria, Tom, Sophie, the family he'd built without realizing it. They want to change everything, he began. Make this place into something bigger than just a restaurant. A school, basically. A place where people can learn not just cooking, but how to survive in this industry, how to thrive in it. About time, Carmen muttered, making everyone laugh. David, Marco turned to his sous chef. They want to make you director of education, formalize all those training programs you've been running behind my back. David blushed. Chef 1. You deserve it, Marco cut him off. You all deserve so much more than I've been able to give you lately. He took a deep breath. They're offering a partnership, equal stakes, a chance to build something that could help a lot of people. But I won't do it without your support. This isn't just my restaurant anymore, it's ours. The staff exchanged looks, then Carmen stepped forward. Marco Rossi, she said firmly, if you don't sign that contract, we'll all quit and go work for Ramsay anyway. The kitchen erupted in laughter and agreement. Marco felt tears welling up in his eyes. Right then, he wiped his eyes quickly. Let's do this. He walked back into the dining room, where the board was waiting patiently. Ramsay looked up expectantly. Before I sign, Marco said, I need to say something. He turned to Ramsay. I was wrong. About you, about everything. I let my fear and pride nearly destroy everything I built. But worse than that, I became the kind of chef I always promised myself I wouldn't be. Someone who tears others down instead of building them up. Ramsay stood, extending his hand. The past is the past. What matters is what we build now. Marco took his hand, then picked up the pen. His signature on the contract felt like both an ending and a beginning. Well then, Ramsay grinned, shall we tell them? The staff was called in, and for the next hour, the dining room was filled with excitement as the plans were laid out. David's face when he saw his new job description. Carmen's joy at the prospect of expanding her pastry program. Maria's tears when she learned she'd be helping teach ESL classes for kitchen staff. As the board members left and the staff began prep for that evening's service, their first as something more than just a restaurant, Ramsay pulled Marco aside. You know what the best part of all this is? He asked. Marco raised an eyebrow. That viral video? It's going to help us launch the school. Nothing sells a redemption story like a happy ending. They both laughed, the tension of the past few days finally breaking. That night, as Marco watched his kitchen, his school, in action, he realized something. Sometimes the biggest victories don't come from never falling, but from having the courage to get back up. And sometimes, the help you need comes from the very person you pushed away. The golden spoon was about to become something new, something better. And Marco Rossi, the chef who'd once let pride nearly destroy everything, was ready to learn, to grow, and most importantly, to teach others how to avoid the same mistakes he'd made. As service wound down, he looked at the frame on his office wall, the viral video story, now printed and preserved. Below it, a new addition, a photo of him and Ramsay, signing the partnership agreement. Two chefs, once adversaries, now partners in something bigger than themselves. The Golden Spoon's new chapter was just beginning. The evening service that night was unlike any other in the Golden Spoon's history. The news of the partnership had leaked, and suddenly, the dining room was packed. People who had canceled their reservations were calling back, desperate for a table. Chef Sophie rushed into the kitchen. There's a 2-hour wait at the door. And social media, it's exploding. Marco checked his phone briefly. The original viral video was now being shared alongside news of the partnership. The comments had completely shifted. This is what leadership looks like. From conflict to collaboration, this is the food industry we need. Can't wait to apply to the new culinary program. Back to work, Marco called out, but he was smiling. David, show me what you're thinking for the training kitchen layout. David spread out some rough sketches on a prep table between orders. We could convert the private dining room into a classroom space, maybe add some cameras for demonstration purposes. Like this? Ramsay appeared beside them, adding to the sketch. He'd stayed to help with service, working the line like any other chef. The staff had been nervous at first, but his easy manner and obvious skill had quickly won them over. "Chef," Maria called from the fish station, "come look at this sauce. Something's not quite right." Ramsay and Marco both started moving, then laughed as they realized they'd both responded to chef. "Your kitchen?" Ramsay gestured with a smile. Marco tasted the sauce, considering. "Add a touch of acid. Maybe yuzu instead of lemon?" Maria's eyes lit up. "Yes, that's exactly what it needs." The night continued in this way. Cooking, teaching, planning for the future. The energy in the kitchen was electric. Every so often, Marco would catch Ramsay watching him interact with his staff, nodding approvingly. During a brief lull, Carmen cornered them both by the pastry station. "So," she said, wielding a piping bag like a weapon, "when do we start the advanced pastry program?" "Already planning to take over, are you?" Ramsay laughed. "Please," Carmen rolled her eyes. "I've been running this place for years while this one," she pointed the piping bag at Marco, "pretended he could do everything himself." "She's not wrong," Marco admitted. "Carmen was the first person I hired. She's been telling me to expand the training program for ages." "Smart woman," Ramsay nodded. "We'll need someone to head up the pastry department in the school." Carmen's face lit up. "Really?" "Really," Marco confirmed. "Though God help any student who doesn't properly temper their chocolate." The night wound down eventually, the last customers leaving with smiles and compliments. The kitchen was spotless. Both chefs insisted on it, and the staff gathered for the traditional end-of-service meeting. "Tomorrow," Marco began, "we start planning for real. The restaurant stays open, but we'll begin renovations for the school next week. David and Carmen will start developing their curricula. Maria, you'll work with the ESL program coordinator." He looked around at his team, his family, and felt a surge of pride. Not the old, defensive pride that had nearly ruined everything, but something new, pride in what they could build together. "One more thing." Ramsay stepped forward. "Marco, show them." Marco pulled out a new frame for the wall. Inside was the original viral video story, the partnership announcement, and between them, a simple handwritten note. "Sometimes our biggest critics become our greatest allies, and sometimes asking for help is the strongest thing we can do. Gr. We'll hang this in the school," Marco said, "to remind every student that failure isn't the end. It's just the beginning of something better." As the staff headed home, Marco and Ramsay sat at the bar, each with a well-deserved whiskey. "You know," Ramsay said thoughtfully, "when I saw that viral video, I knew exactly what had to happen. But I never expected it to work out quite this perfectly." Marco raised an eyebrow. "You mean you planned all this?" "Not all of it. But I knew a chef with your talent, your passion for teaching. You just needed a wake-up call. And maybe someone who understood exactly what you were going through." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. "Thank you," Marco said finally. "Not just for the partnership, but for seeing past my moment of madness." "We've all had them," Ramsay shrugged. "The difference is what we learn from them." The next morning, as Marco unlocked the restaurant door, he paused to look at the sign. Soon it would read, "The Golden Spoon, Restaurant and Culinary Academy." But more importantly, it would represent something that had almost been lost. The idea that in the culinary world, we're all students, all teachers, all part of something bigger than ourselves. And sometimes, the best lessons come from our biggest mistakes.